Please welcome Aspen Economic Strategy Group Co-Chair Erskine Bowles.
Thank you, Amy. And good afternoon to everybody and welcome. We're delighted you could join us this afternoon for this podcast. I'm Erskine Bowles and I've co-chaired the Aspen Economic Strategy Group for the past 5 years with the best partner that anybody could ever have, my old friend and good friend, Hank Paulson. Today, we are pleased to release our 2021 policy volume, which is entitled Rebuilding the Post-Pandemic Economy. And as all of you have known and experienced nearly 2 years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic paralyzed the global economy. In response, policymakers in the US and from around the world deployed unprecedented fiscal and monetary assistance to counter the concurrent supply and demand shocks caused by widespread shutdowns and other causes. In the US, leaders provided unprecedented aid for unemployed workers and troubled firms, and also intervened with extraordinary measures to stabilize financial markets. Today, the US economy is growing, but recovery has been uneven, and many challenges remain, including a very uncertain inflationary outlook, weak labor supply, supply chain shortages, and growing economic competition with China. Today, we are fortunate to have an excellent group of experts to discuss these forward-looking challenges, along with some of the initial lessons learned from the policy actions taken over the last 2 years. We'll begin with a framing remarks by Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo. Wally, I'm proud to say, is an alumnus of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, as is the Treasury Secretary herself. Wally's remarks will be followed by a panel discussion with Chad Brown of the Peterson Institute, Jason Furman of Harvard University, Michael Strain of AEI, and Holly Wade of the NFIB. And this will be moderated by our very own fabulous director here at the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, Melissa Kearney. Now, let me extend a warm welcome to our friend, to the Deputy Treasury Secretary, who's doing a fabulous job and who we're so grateful to for your public service. Wally, over to you, my friend. And again, thank you for all you're doing.
Well, Erskine, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you very much to the Aspen Economic Strategy Group for inviting me to join you for this important conversation. As a former member of the Economic Strategy Group, I'm well aware of this group's ability to produce and disseminate powerful ideas that will help create shared, lasting prosperity. I first joined the Treasury Department, as many of you know, in February of 2009, in the midst of the Great Recession. Real GDP peaked in the second quarter of 2008, returning to pre-crisis levels only after 2.5 years. The unemployment rate was 8.3%, and we now know it would take approximately a decade to return to pre-recession levels, leaving millions of Americans struggling for far too long, creating the type of scarring that has long-lasting impacts. This administration has taken that experience and its lessons to heart. President Biden's response to the pandemic was designed to get our economy back on track sooner and keep American families and businesses whole until we reach the other side of the pandemic. Looking at where we stand today, I believe that approach is succeeding. At no point during this crisis did personal incomes fall below their pre-crisis level. We reached our pre-pandemic GDP level last quarter, in half the time it took after the Great Recession. And after peaking at 14.8% last year, higher than at any point during the financial crisis, the unemployment rate now stands at 4.6%, the same level it took nearly 10 years to reach after the last crisis. This is not to say we don't face further challenges as we recover from a once-in-a-century pandemic. We do. We are acutely aware that pandemic-induced upward pressure on prices hurts American pocketbooks, with supply chain disruptions and labor shortages straining American businesses. The administration is focused on doing two things: taking steps to address the immediate effects of these constraints today, and investing in long-term capacity to prevent them from arising in the future. Still, our path to full economic recovery depends on our ongoing efforts to defeat the pandemic. As President Biden has made clear, our best defense against the spread of new variants is to get vaccinated, get boosted, and to follow the advice of our public health officials. But because of the unprecedented vaccine campaign, today, over 197 million Americans are fully vaccinated, and 82% of adults have received at least one shot. As a result of the president's efforts, tens of thousands of businesses have reopened, and we've added more than 5.5 million jobs since January. As we continue to work to end the pandemic, we must also take steps to implement policies that will allow us to build a post-pandemic economy that works for everyone. I would like to share a few thoughts on 3 critical economic issues we must address in order to ensure we're building an inclusive and competitive post-pandemic economy. The first opportunity I want to discuss is the transition to a digital economy. The ongoing shift in economic activity to online markets, digitization, and the technology sector. Even before the pandemic, the digital economy was already driving economic growth. From 2000 to 2020, the share of US adults who use the internet grew from just over 50% to 90%. And the share of US retail sales conducted through e-commerce rose almost 14-fold. COVID-19 only accelerated this trend. From the first quarter of 2020 to the second, the e-commerce share of retail sales increased nearly 40%. According to a survey of corporate executives, the pandemic accelerated the integration of information technology in their businesses by the equivalent of several years' worth of technology adoption in just a few months. We are likely still in the early days of this economic transformation. The acceleration of this shift during the pandemic has underscored that access to high-speed internet is essential to economic opportunity. This is why the president has made universal broadband access a key element of his agenda. The $65 billion to deliver high-speed internet to all Americans and close the digital divide contained in the bipartisan infrastructure package has the capacity to transform communities in the same way the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 improved productivity in agricultural communities throughout our country. As we've also discovered this year, the digital economy is dependent on goods like semiconductors. During the third quarter of this year, global sales of semiconductors increased 27% over the third quarter of 2020. And as the digital economy continues to expand globally, this need will only continue to rise. The wide-ranging impacts of the current shortage of semiconductors and other critical goods has accelerated our focus on the need to build resilient supply chains. This is why the administration has proposed incentives to boost domestic semiconductor production and other advanced manufacturing, as well as stood up efforts to address near-term supply chain constraints. It is essential that as we think about the growth of the digital economy, we take steps to make sure that all Americans have the ability to benefit from the prosperity the transition is creating. The second opportunity that demands urgent action is climate change. We know climate change is an existential risk with real economic consequences. Extreme weather events and climate disasters cost the U.S. approximately $100 billion last year alone, and those costs are only rising over time. We know the public sector alone cannot make the investments needed to address the threat of climate change, which could reduce global output by 10% if we fail to meet our 2050 net zero emissions target. To date, private capital has not moved quickly enough to address this challenge and capitalize on this opportunity. We need decisive government action to create the conditions for transformative private investment, just as we've had in the past, from DARPA investments that led to the modern internet to Operation Warp Speed's acceleration of the path to COVID-19 vaccines. That's why the president's Build Back Better proposal includes over $550 billion to combat climate change and catalyze the private investments we need. For example, by offering tax credits for consumers to purchase electric vehicles, alongside the infrastructure deals funding to build EV charging stations, we can crowd in private capital to support electrical vehicle production. We're also committed to mobilizing additional resources for climate finance. We must focus on ensuring that we make the transition to a net zero economy in a way that allows us to address the challenges that climate change presents, while also positioning us at the forefront of the innovation and job creation this transition will catalyze. The fundamental shifts facing our economy constitute an inflection point. If managed effectively, they offer a chance to reduce inequality and create an economy that works for everyone. If mismanaged, they risk further exacerbating our country's economic disparities. Today, the top 1% of US households own 32% of household wealth, while the bottom 50% holds less than 2%. Unfortunately, though perhaps not surprisingly, this disparity also falls along racial lines. The median wealth of white households is 7.8 times that of Black households and 5.2 times that of Hispanic households. The cost of inequality falls most heavily on those most vulnerable, families who lose the roof over their heads to eviction or cannot put food on the table. But inequality also exacts a cost on all of us, holding back broad-based economic growth. Research suggests that if women, people of color, and low-income children had the same opportunities as high-income white males, the US would have 4 times as many investors as it does today, with those inventors and innovations adding to growth and productivity. The president's economic agenda puts these disparities squarely in its crosshairs. This starts with the generational investment in America's children. The expanded child tax credit enacted as part of the American Rescue Plan lifted 3.5 million children out of poverty. And the president's economic proposal calls for extending the expanded CTC and making it permanently refundable. In addition, the president is calling on Congress to provide universal preschool for all 3 and 4-year-olds, the largest expansion in American public education in a century. These 2 policies will significantly reduce childhood poverty and improve educational outcomes for millions of American children. Addressing inequality also requires us to take steps to reduce the barriers to the flow of capital to underserved communities. The Biden administration is providing $22 billion in capital through the Emergency Capital Investment Program and Small Business Credit Initiative, much of which will flow to underserved areas and communities of color. These federal investments will lay the groundwork to expand opportunities in these communities, but additional private capital is needed to help unlock their full economic potential. A number of private companies have taken steps to meet this challenge, but much more action is needed. We also need to remain focused on affordable housing. The growth of housing supply in the United States has consistently undershot demand since the Great Recession, and the pandemic has only made this problem worse. This is why the president has proposed a number of incentives to increase the supply of affordable housing, and why this administration is already providing tens of billions of dollars in assistance to renters and homeowners struggling due to the pandemic. Finally, one of the most important things we can do to address inequality is to make sure our tax system raises the resources needed to build an economy that works for everyone. This is especially true for corporations and those making more than $400,000 a year, making sure they take on more of the burden to provide the resources to fund everything from the military to expanded educational opportunities for our children, and creating opportunities for those that have been left behind for too long is critical to our economic success. Today, corporate income tax revenues as a share of GDP is less than a third of what it was in the 1960s. Federal revenues as a share of GDP have gone from 20% in 2000 to 16% in 2020. The president's tax proposals address these trends, and we look forward to the implementation of a number of these policies as part of the Build Back Better Act. Let me conclude by returning to where I began. We know the challenges remain to restore the economy to secure footing, and we're all committed to tackling those challenges using the full array of our economic tools, from programs to help bring Americans back to work through vaccinations and child care to support long-term investments in our infrastructure. But a look at where we are today, I see the progress we have made as well, and the evidence that the lessons we learned from the last crisis put us on a stronger path to recovery in this one. and closer to when we can confidently say that we are in the post-pandemic economy. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to hearing the conversation.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. The next panel will begin in just a few moments. Please welcome Aspen Economic Strategy Group Director, Melissa Carney.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you to the Deputy Secretary for joining us today and for his substantive remarks on the ongoing challenges that the U.S. economy still faces. So as Wally just said, we're not quite in the post-pandemic economy, though our panel discussion is perhaps optimistically titled The Post-Pandemic Economic Recovery. I hope we can all agree, and I hope it's true, that at least the worst of the economic crisis is behind us. That said, we still have very challenging economic conditions, as Wally alluded to. Job openings and nominal wages are growing rapidly, but there are supply shortages, worker shortages, high levels of inflation, and of course, continued uncertainty and disruptions related to COVID itself. So I'm thrilled to have this panel of experts with us today to talk about these ongoing challenges and how we can build a stronger economy post-pandemic. Chad Found, who's Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and author of the AESG report being released today as part of our new policy volume titled America and International Trade Cooperation. We have Jason Furman, Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard University and former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration, also a member of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at AEI and a member of the AESG, and Holly Wade, Executive Director of the NFIB Research Center. So I'm going to start with a question for each of you to set the stage about how you see the current economic challenges facing the U.S. Chad, let's start with you. You're an expert in U.S. trade and international economic issues. To what extent are the current supply challenges that the U.S. is facing, to what extent are they driven by challenges related to international bottlenecks, trade disputes, as opposed to more domestic challenges like a lack of workers or perhaps a greater return of consumer demand than businesses were anticipating?
So first, let me say thanks to you, Melissa, and to the whole Aspen team for being a part of this program today and overall project. So I think your question is a really, really good one. I don't think we have great evidence yet to put precise figures on it. I think it's a little bit of all of the above. It's true that every time we get a new data dump, it does seem that demand, especially for goods, is still extraordinarily high, and a lot of consumer goods, especially, are traded and coming in through the ports, and there's been a lot of pressure put on those things. And some of the bottlenecks have happened because it's a pandemic that's not over yet, and at various points in time along various supply chains, you have had to have shutdowns that have, delayed a part or component being made here or there somewhere around the world from getting on to the next spot in the supply chain where it needs to go into the next widget, where it then needs to get shipped to go into the next thing. And anytime one of those little hiccups occurs, that can kind of create an additional bottleneck. So I think the answer is all of the above. I think as a trade person's perspective, we kind of can't forget that there is only really a truce in this trade war thing that we have with China. There's still tariffs on over $300 billion worth of American imports that makes for some products that we import from China, America a less attractive destination than other places that China might want to send it to. So that's not helping, I think, resolve necessarily the supply chain bottlenecks either. Short answer is all of the above, and we're gonna, I think, and it's not over anytime soon either.
So you might have just hinted at this, but is there anything that you would recommend to the Biden administration or Congress that they could do in the near term, in the next 6 months, to relieve some of these pressures?
Well, I think most of the fixes are unfortunately of the longer term investment variety, whether it's trying to help facilitate some of the trade going through ports and making that go more smoothly. Kind of domestic infrastructure. I think what the administration has tried to do in terms of short-term policy fixes, they've done the right things. Even getting rid of some of the tariffs, would arguably contribute to some of that pressure. Now, obviously, we now live in a world where tariffs really aren't about economic arguments anymore. So in this panel, we'll focus mainly on economics. These arguments will mean a lot, but in unfortunate policy circles where tariffs are all about geostrategic rivalry and China's economic system and all these other things, it's a bit broader than that, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, if they had the political opportunity in a bipartisan fashion to kind of everybody agree to kind of roll back some of the tariffs on China, I think that would help alleviate probably a little bit of the challenges facing supply chains. Am I optimistic that'll happen? No.
Yeah, right. Great, thank you. Okay, Jason, I'm going to turn to you. There's a lot of different metrics out there measuring the current state of the economy, GDP growth, various measures of labor market tightness or slack, rates of business investment, consumer spending. What metrics are you paying the most attention to? And what's your overall read of the sometimes conflicting metrics in terms of where the economy is right now?
So I pay attention to all the metrics, but let me try to be more helpful than that. Broadly speaking, I think there's an economic story where, number one, the economy has, on the real side, improved very rapidly and is in better shape than we were expecting, even after the American Rescue Plan passed. Number two, the economy is still in a hole and still has some ways to go. And number three, inflation is a big problem. And let me go through the metrics for all three of those. For the first one, in terms of the improvement in the economy, the unemployment rate is the first number to look at. It's 4.6% right now. That's back where it was in 2017. The economy wasn't perfect in 2017, but it wasn't in catastrophically bad shape in 2017 either. We're getting closer to maximum employment. For number two, still a ways to go. You see that partly in the unemployment rate, but you see that even more in labor force participation. That's been the most surprising aspect of the economy. The labor force participation rate has really stalled out. Part of that's the aging of the population, part of that's some residual weakness in the economy, but about half of it has no obvious explanation. It's divided between retirement age people and not retirement age people. So maybe retirement is part of it, but it's definitely only part of it. It's roughly equally divided between men and women. There's probably a lot of different causes. I tend to lean against the psychological, all of a sudden people decided they didn't like their jobs. I think a lot of jobs weren't great in 2019 either. They were just better than the alternative, which was not working. The comparative benefits of those have changed, in part because people have more cash, in part because job openings are so high. In terms of the third and inflation, we all look at the headline inflation numbers. Those are extremely high. It's 6.2% over the last year. Some of that is probably temporary stuff that's going to go away. The oil price is a global thing. It's not a US policy specific thing. It's been adding to inflation. It's probably the part of inflation people like the least, and the part the president can control, and the Fed can control the least. But even if you strip away some of the fluky parts of inflation, you still have a pretty high inflation rate. And you have some shoes that probably haven't dropped yet. For example, the cost of rent has been going up. It hasn't been going up as quickly as it did in the past. And it's likely to go up more quickly in the future. So personally, I think it's likely that the inflation rate will fall from this year's 6%, but won't fall to anywhere near the 2% that the Fed had been hoping that it would do. Finally, in addition to looking at these data to reach this conclusion about the economy, I teach the intro economics class at Harvard. I teach them supply and demand. If you think about your supply and demand right, you can get very far in life. And interpreting these data, there's two ways to think about what's going on with all the supply issues Chad talked about. One is supply chains suddenly get worse. A factory closes in Malaysia because of COVID, closes in China because of electricity. That's an inward shift of the supply curve, and it drives the price up, inflation, and the quantity down. Everything I've just told you, though, is that's not what's the main thing that's happening. The main thing that's happening is prices are going up and quantities are going up. People are spending 10% more on goods than they used to. They're spending 20% more on some goods like toys, instruments, and guns. So, what does that second model say? It's the demand curve shifted out. That you shifted up the supply curve and prices went up and quantities went up. In other words, the problem isn't that our supply chains have gotten worse. It's that our supply chains haven't gotten better as quickly as we wanted them to get better. That, in other words, demand has outstripped supply. There's a little bit of all of this going on, both some deteriorations of supply, especially workers, but I think far more of it, the evidence lines up for it being demand has increased a lot and supply increased too. It just didn't increase as much as we would have liked.
Great, thanks. So I think before I ask you what you think this all implies for what policymakers can do in the short term, I'm going to ask Michael, do you agree with Jason's assessment of the economic situation, or are you reading some of those indicators differently?
No, I'm in broad general agreement with Jason. I think the big problem facing the economy and the labor market is the same, which is an imbalance between demand and supply. In the labor market, you see white hot demand for workers. You see record numbers of job openings. You see the number of unemployed workers for every one open job. That's down to about 0.75%. Which is much lower than it has been in quite some time. In other words, there are fewer than one unemployed worker for every job opening. It is common to hear businesses complain about not being able to find workers. It's common to hear businesses talk about labor shortages. I think the right impulse is to dismiss those concerns. Historically speaking, in this case, I think that is not the right impulse. And the reason I say that is because employers are putting their money where their mouths are. You see wages growing throughout the economy at around 5%. In some industries like leisure and hospitality, you see wages growing around 12%, which is remarkably rapid nominal wage growth. And so employers really are putting their money where their mouths are in order to attract and retain workers, and there just aren't enough workers out there. And so you have a demand supply imbalance in the labor market. I think focusing more on the supply side, workforce participation, the rate at which adults participate in the workforce really hasn't improved much since the summer of 2020, which is remarkable given how quickly wages are growing. If you break that down and look at different age groups, you see that workforce participation has not recovered for people over the age of 54. Workforce participation has not recovered for people of prime working age between the ages of 25 and 54. And participation has not recovered among younger workers, ages 20 to 24. When I say recovered, I mean returned to its February of 2020 level, the month before the pandemic began. That is kind of a mystery as to why that would be the case. I think that the generosity of unemployment insurance benefits has kept workers on the sidelines. And I think the stimulus checks that have really ballooned household savings. Households are sitting on about $2.5 trillion of excess savings up and down the income distribution. Those savings, I think, are also leading workers to be choosier than they otherwise would be. And you see a similar phenomenon, I think, outside the labor market of the economy as a whole. I think Jason's right about supply chains. My understanding is that our ports are actually processing more cargo than they typically do. Why do we still see cargo ships lined up outside ports waiting days and days to be unloaded? Because because purchases of goods on the part of consumers and households are that much higher than they used to be. I'm worried to build on Jason's concerns about inflation. I'm becoming increasingly worried about inflation. I'm becoming increasingly worried that inflation is going to be a drag on the economy, and increasingly worried that that forward-looking expectations about inflation are starting to become unanchored to the Fed's target. You see consumer confidence numbers in the tank, back down to where they were when the economy was emerging from the 2008 global financial crisis because of inflation that's really souring households. If you ask small businesses how many of them plan to increase prices over the next 3 months, the net share that do is over 50%. That's the highest share of businesses that plan to increase prices in the past 4 decades, which is when the survey began. If you ask households what they expect inflation to be next year, you see households are expecting 5% inflation, which is 3 percentage points above the Fed's 2% target, more than double the Fed's 2% target. If you look at the bond market, you see that investors expect inflation over the next 5 years to average about a percentage point above the Fed's target. And those expectations have doubled relative to 1 year ago. If you look at the bond market for 2026 to 2031, you see that they still expect inflation to be above the Fed's target. So I'm starting to become more and more worried about the psychological impacts of the price increases we've been experiencing.
Well, I want to let Holly jump in on what small businesses are saying and feeling and doing. But before we do that, Michael, both you and Jason referred to a supply not meeting demand, but you highlighted the potential role of excess household savings that they've built up because of the generous unemployment enhancements and the stimulus checks. That money households should be winding their way through that money. So do you think then these supply and demand is just going to equalize anytime soon as households no longer have excess savings?
Look, my expectation is that demand is going to cool as you sort of start running out of money and run out of things to buy. My family hasn't figured out how to run out of things to buy, but eventually we will. And supply will be asymptoting up. The problem is demand is coming from above normal, and supply is trying to catch up for normal. And so I think for at least another year, we could have an imbalance, and that's upward inflationary pressure for a year. And at that point, what does that do to expectations, to nominal wages and the like, is anyone's guess.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Holly, your research group at the NFIB put out a report last month indicating that small business owners remain pessimistic about business conditions in the near future. To what extent has the situation facing small businesses improved since the spring or summer of 2020? And what is the nature of the ongoing challenges that you hear small businesses say they're dealing with?
Sure. So our monthly survey, our monthly small business economic trends survey, in the beginning of or the second quarter of 2020, certainly small business owners were hurt by the crisis. They were struggling to figure out how to keep employees on payroll. We had those huge programs to help stabilize the foundation of the small business sector. However, now we've switched to a different set of challenges, and not surprisingly for small business owners, The two main challenges are the staffing shortage that they're facing and supply chain disruptions. And small business owners are in a unique set of circumstances in that they don't have often the tools that, say, larger companies have to navigate these headwinds. And so we've seen unprecedented levels of small business owners saying that they have unfilled job openings, that they can't fill, that they're not having the number of applicants apply for these jobs like they used to. For many of them, they're not finding any applicants for these positions to fill. And that's causing a lot of lost sales opportunities that they are experiencing, many of them significant lost sales opportunities. So as consumer spending for goods and services are increasing, unfortunately, small business owners are having a hard time taking advantage of these increased consumer spending trends. And then on the supply chain disruption side of things, more small business owners are actually reporting that they are impacted by supply chain disruptions than on the staffing shortage, just because there are more that have supply chain issues, regardless if they're an employer business or non-employer business. And it spans all types of products. So whether it's microchips or poultry, paper goods, lumber, they are all experiencing in one way or another trying to navigate these issues. And those are also causing lost sales opportunities for the small business sector. So they're in a bind. They're having a hard time dealing with both of these problems. And they're trying to adjust business operations accordingly as best they can. That includes increasing compensation. So more small business owners are increasing compensation to try and retain their current employees, but also attract applicants for those open positions at levels that we've never seen before. And then also trying to absorb those price increases through increasing their prices of goods and services. And we've seen that escalate over the last few months. And then when we look at some of the questions that are related to inventory and inventory satisfaction, we have a historically high number saying that inventory satisfaction is too low. They're trying to, access those inventories that they're looking for to stock the shelves, which is putting a lot of pressure on small business owners. One of the main impediments for small business owners in dealing with all of this is just the amount of time that they have to navigate. So when we ask about how they're adjusting business operations to accommodate for staffing shortage, they're having to put in more hours. So in putting more hours into operating their business, there's less time to navigate some of these other issues, whether that is, improving technology for productivity or finding other suppliers that might be available to deal with, shelf stocking. But they're having a difficult time. When in October, our last survey, when asking, what they anticipate business conditions in the next 6 months, we had record level of small business owners saying that they anticipate business conditions becoming worse. So about half are saying that they anticipate business conditions becoming worse. We haven't seen that level of pessimism for that question since third quarter 1979. So the situation is not great for small businesses.
How big are yours when you refer to small businesses? How big or small are these businesses, and how many businesses are you talking about in your survey?
Sure. So our survey, our monthly survey and our special COVID survey, they're both random samples of NFIB members. And our members are mostly employer businesses and tend to be around 5 to 10 employees on average. So they are very small. They do span all industry sectors across the country.
Great. So I'm going to turn to the economists. So if small businesses are doing what, we usually economists like to say they should do, raise wages, attract more workers, and that's not solving the problem, what are the types of things you all might recommend to policymakers could do to alleviate some of the imbalances, the inflationary pressures, the worker shortages that we've been talking about for the past few minutes?
One thing that worries me is that that policymakers won't solve this problem, but that instead businesses themselves will solve it. One of the more remarkable features of the economy is that we are kind of back to pre-pandemic levels of nominal output with 6 million fewer workers than we would have had if there weren't the pandemic, which of course means that workers are producing more, that businesses are more productive than they used to be. I think a lot of workers are on the sidelines, again, because of the generosity of government benefits. A lot of workers are on the sidelines because their checking accounts have swollen due to excess savings. And, they're looking around and they're seeing that labor demand is white hot, and they're thinking to themselves, well, or some of them, I assume, are thinking to themselves that, a job will be waiting for them when they're ready to go back, or they're being, they're kind of looking for a job, but they're being quite choosy. I'm concerned that at some point businesses are just going to say, well, we know how to operate with a smaller workforce, and that we'll see labor demand really cool off before workers who are on the sidelines realize that if they want to grab a chair in the game of musical chairs that's happening, they need to do that sooner rather than later. So I'm becoming increasingly concerned about long-term unemployment. I'm becoming increasingly concerned about a persistently lower employment rate, a persistently lower workforce participation rate than we would have had in the absence of the pandemic. And I'm not sure that there is a whole lot that policymakers can do, this month or next month to turn that around.
Of course, on the one hand, this is not great for workers who will be displaced by these sort of capital technological investments. On the other hand, this could be a boost to productivity, and the Deputy Secretary talked about the rapid digitization of the economy. So, Jason, what are your thoughts on this?
6-month horizon, the main solution to these problems are time. The market mechanism raises prices, raises wages, that attracts workers, gets suppliers in, and we just don't have a lot of tools for the supply side of the economy, and we have even fewer for very specific sectors and specific businesses. I think there are things the Fed should do about inflation in general. I think it's fine for the administration to do whatever it can to work with ports and whatever. I don't think it'll add up to a lot, but it's worth doing. It's also worth making sure they're not doing things to worsen supply chains. We recently doubled tariffs on lumber from Canada, for example. It was an administrative decision by the Commerce Department, but figuring out, and maybe Chad could figure out how not to do things like that would be good right now. At the same time, we're going to have problems 3 years from now and 10 years from now too. Those are ones policymakers can do more to solve. So, childcare and preschool are two problems with labor supply in our country, two problems, preschool that impede the skills of people as they, get an education and enter the workforce. So I wouldn't suggest that we get so distracted by things that we can't solve on a 6-month horizon, where the market actually is the right way to do them, that we avoid thinking about some of the very significant market failures we have. Improving preschool, a lot of the impact of that for small businesses will be felt a little bit right away because parents will be able to work more, but some of it will be felt 25 years from now when those kids get an education, grow up, and become better employees for the businesses that Holly and all of us care so much about. So I think, patience in the short run, focus on the medium and long run is the best strategy right now.
So I want to shift a minute to drawing some lessons from the government response, and specifically the government response in terms of helping businesses through the real crisis at the sort of the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, we had the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided direct support to small and mid-sized businesses. In one of the chapters that's in the policy volume that Aspen Economic Strategy Group is releasing today, it's written by Samuel Hansen and Adi Sunderman, both of the Harvard Business School, and Eric Zwick of the Booth School of Business at Chicago. And they argue that the unique features of the pandemic-induced recession in 2020 justified this kind of direct government support in the form of these low interest, often forgivable loans. But they argue that in a recovery and in a more garden variety recession, the economic arguments for direct government support like that are weaker. But instead, policymakers should pull on the usual fiscal and monetary policy levers. Of course, we've talked about the fact that those are better aimed at addressing demand shortfalls, not supply shortfalls. They also say the government could promote reallocation by taking steps to promote firm entry and exit. Do you all agree with that assessment of both this type of reaction was the right thing to do during the pandemic, but probably isn't what's needed in a recovery and in a future in recession? There are better things we could prepare for to support businesses through this type of economic downturn. Whoever wants to go first.
There are two extremes in policy towards small business. At one extreme, there's grants. You get money, you don't need to pay it back. At the other extreme are something like a loan on commercial terms. You get it, you pay it back. It's not that different from what you could have gotten from a bank. The response that we did to COVID was mostly grants. I mean, forgivable loans or grants. There was very little in the way of conditions in terms of needing to prove the amount of damage that happened as a result of COVID. The owners could pocket much of that in the form of a windfall for themselves if their business was still operating and the like. It was designed in a hurry, might have been hard to design it a whole lot better. I think the bang for the buck in terms of long-term jobs probably wasn't that high, in that businesses that wanted to hire 6 months later could, and businesses that didn't have customers 6 months later were going to lay off workers even if they kept them on for that loan. So I think it was probably designed in the wrong way, but it was a crazy moment in the economy and the like. Then there's the other end. The Fed had a Main Street lending program that it chose to have basically commercial terms for. It was told by Congress, you can lose the money on these loans. We're going to give you some capital. If you lose this money, that's okay. You're legally $450 billion or whatever it is, not just for Main Street, but for a suite of programs. And the Fed, one, is not very good at being an actual bank because it doesn't lend to small businesses, not what it does. And second of all, it chose in conjunction with the Treasury, possibly because the Treasury told it to set those terms in a very strict, tough way that looked a lot like commercial loans. And as a result, there was very little take up, and it did very little good for the world. What we need next time is something in between those two, something that's more like a loan. You do it if you have, you put some skin in the game. The government gets to share some of the benefits of your success in the form of being repaid. It's not just giving out gifts. But those loans aren't on commercial terms. They have greater guarantees or lower interest rates or less senior repayment or longer payment terms. I don't know exactly what it is you want. And thinking about how to design that is complicated institutionally in terms of who delivers it, complicated in terms of designing the terms. And so, thinking about it now, like Eric Zwick and co-authors are doing, is exactly the right thing to be doing.
I could jump in talking about or hearing from our members through our surveys. The PPP program was certainly helpful in supporting the small business sector because everything was so chaotic, and the time frame of small business owners running through their savings and profits and earnings was quick. So the speed to which they were able to release the funding for that program through private financial institutions was imperative for the small business sector at the beginning. Certainly, it could be restructured, I think, to maybe look somewhat similar to the PPP round 2, where there were more guardrails on who qualified for the program. It was still obviously a forgivable program, but that you had, for eligibility, show 25% reduction in revenues from one quarter to another. And so that, puts some kind of criteria around eligibility for the program, which was about half of those who participated in the first round of PPP. So something like that. But there's also the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program that was hugely popular to small businesses. About a third of our members took advantage, or a quarter to a third took advantage of that program. Through the SBA, there were obviously a few hiccups in being able to process those loans and staffing the SBA to a point where they could handle that volume. But a 3.75% interest on a 30-year loan was very attractive to a lot of small business owners at the time, especially after they ran through their PPP loan funding and still needed additional support. But when something happens so quickly and so dramatically, a grant program of some magnitude, I think was the appropriate measure for supporting small business owners. Maybe, having a few more criteria available to kind of tailor who's eligible for that would be helpful going forward. But the speed to which going through private institutions, financial institutions, I think was paramount in making sure that the funding was distributed to small business owners in a timely way so that they could stay solvent and stay up and running as best they could.
I'm more sympathetic to the PPP program than Jason, and I'm less sympathetic to the need to ever do something like it again than either Jason or Holly. I think one of the most remarkable features of the U.S. economy over the last year and a half or so has been the absence of a huge spike in bankruptcies. That is what no one predicted that, even given the existence of the PPP program. When the early months of the bankruptcy data came in, there were lots of attempts to explain it by saying, well, the courts aren't operating, or et cetera, businesses aren't filing, maybe there's a bunch of informal bankruptcy that'll eventually show up as business closures. That hasn't happened yet. And I think the Paycheck Protection Program should get a lot of credit for avoiding that wave of bankruptcies that we were all concerned would come. That wave of bankruptcies would have been a massive economic loss, because the businesses that would have been bankrupt as of February 2020 would have been productive, valuable, healthy businesses, and they would not have been outcompeted by a competitor. They would not have gone out of fashion because consumers' preferences or tastes had changed. They would not have gone under because of bad management decisions. They would instead have closed because of this event that was entirely outside the economic system, and that would have just been a waste. The evidence that I've seen suggests that PPP eligible businesses had employment elevated relative to larger businesses that were ineligible for 6 months, for 9 months after the program started, which suggests that there really were effects of PPP on employment that lasted into the medium term for quite some time after the economy had come out of the lockdowns. I don't think people would have predicted it would have been that successful when the program was rolled out, successful at supporting employment and successful at avoiding business closures. Having said that, it is hard for me to imagine circumstances where that type of a government intervention would be helpful to the economy as a whole. Certainly, it would be helpful to the businesses receiving support, but whether it would be helpful to the economy as a whole, I think, is another question. I think Holly's comment about the kind of PPP version 2 that included a revenue loss test certainly addresses Jason's concern that businesses that were doing fine ended up getting PPP loans. But I'm not sure those are the businesses we would want to subsidize in a garden variety normal downturn. You'd be subsidizing businesses that aren't adapting well to the changing business cycle. You'd be subsidizing businesses that aren't able to keep their revenue up in spite of the downturn. It seems to me that those are the businesses that if you had to pick between those businesses and businesses that didn't have a 25% revenue loss, you would want the second group of businesses to be the ones that make it through the recession. So there's there's a tension here, right? On the one hand, you don't want there to be wasteful liquidations. You don't want there to be wasteful separations of workers and firms. You don't want there to be wasteful separations of firms and customer networks and supplier networks. On the other hand, you don't want to stop the process of the economy reaching its new equilibrium, because that is going to be what ultimately brings down the unemployment rate and what restores the economy to health. During the lockdowns in March of 2020, the former was going to be such a catastrophe that putting the brakes on the reallocation process, I think, made sense. During a garden variety recession, I'm not sure that's what I would advise.
But but Michael, this is going to depend on whether you expect the cause of whatever the recession, the cause of the recession, if that's going to stay with us, and so the reallocation should happen, or if it's ideally something temporary, like a public health crisis that will abate, right?
Yeah, I think if we had another pandemic, or if we had another situation where the government was telling people to stay home and not go shopping or something like that, then I think we could talk. But a situation where monetary policy makes a mistake, or a situation where we see a big oil price shock, or we see something happen in the financial sector. That's the kind of thing that I think we should expect that businesses and households, but particularly businesses, are able to adapt to. And the basic policy advice of focusing on people, not on businesses or places, I think would apply in those more typical situations.
I want to talk about this idea of lockdowns again, which hopefully we won't ever have to contend with. But we've seen now a new COVID variant emerging, the Omicron variant everyone's talking about. I think it's fair to say that some variant of COVID is likely to be with us for a while. So what I want to shift to talking about that, what the economic implications of that, presumably that will continue to impose a drag on our economic recovery. Chad, in your paper chapter that's part of today's volume, that's the volume that's being released today, you mentioned that COVID is a challenge that requires global cooperation. And you were one of the signatories on an Aspen Economic Strategy Group statement in August that stipulated, and I'll quote, "The United States government should take up a position of world leadership on ending the global COVID-19 pandemic through vaccine outreach to the world." So the Biden administration recently announced it would invest billions in manufacturing capabilities for global vaccine production. In your view, is manufacturing capability the main constraint on distributing more doses around the world? And what else, if anything, can the US be doing to help bring an end to this global pandemic?
So I think the vaccine manufacturing story is complicated. So on the one hand, we were incredibly lucky to have multiple effective vaccines for kind of the initial round of variants, and Operation Warp Speed, what they did in Europe, BioNTech, even what China has done in terms of manufacturing so many vaccines, so many doses of vaccines so quickly, was amazing, and it was not expected at the beginning of the pandemic that we would be able to do this. That being said, we clearly haven't done enough. And I think there is this question, have government policymakers, they did great sort of early on in writing, contracts with manufacturers to have multiple candidates out there, some of them which never made it through clinical trials, which is what you want. You want to overshoot in terms of your diversification. You want to get them manufacturing at risk even before they have been, green lighted through the regulatory process. But then we've sort of reached a moment where, the companies are producing kind of at their own timetable. And it's hard to get them to, add another or a third or a fourth or a fifth production line to really, really, really scale up the vaccine manufacturing capacity. But it seems like that's what we need to do. Now, it's additionally challenging today because we're still waiting for the next at least 10 days or so for more information about whether the existing vaccines that we have, how well they're going to do with respect to Omicron, this next variant that we're facing. And, you know, some of the companies, so the mRNAs, the Pfizer and the Moderna say that, you know, their technologies are such that they'll be able to tweak their formulas and their manufacturing practices so that, you know, within 100 days, they'll be able to generate the new, the new version of their vaccine. I think we'll have to wait and see if that's necessary, A, and then B, if that's actually going to be true. We've never gone through this before, obviously. But this is going to throw another, you know, monkey wrench into the works potentially in terms of how many vaccines that we ultimately need, how well different places of the world are responding based on what the first rounds of vaccines, the varieties that they received. We need a lot more data collection, obviously, and the genomic sequencing and all of this kind of stuff. And at the same time, the world is getting weary of this and, you know, just is kind of being less and less convinced that the scientists and public health officials have any idea what they're doing, right? This thing isn't over yet. So I think there's still a really long road ahead of us. There are obviously a lot of lessons to be learned from the way things have gone so far, but I'm not sure yet we know what the right path is forward. And we have all the information yet to even in an optimal situation, be able to figure that out, let alone be able to implement it. And then you do have other challenges that are out there. A lot of the places that haven't gotten vaccinated yet, it's not because of lack of access to vaccines. It really is the last mile problem. They just, you know, don't have the infrastructure to be able to do the cold chain deliveries, which is, you know, necessary for the Pfizers and the Modernas and things like that. That requires additional investment as well. So there's still lots and lots of challenges ahead.
Jason, Michael, what's your read on the ongoing COVID threat? How much of a drag is that on the economic recovery?
It's a lot of uncertainty,
Yeah.
But my point estimate would be not a huge change in the trajectory of the recovery. The United States and the rest of the world grew really strongly through Delta. We were adding over 600,000 jobs a month. GDP growth in Q3 was, in Q3 was weak, but another measure, gross domestic income, was very strong. So I think the economy probably did better that quarter than the headline numbers show, and that would be more consistent with the better measured jobs data we have. Growth in Europe was incredibly strong in the third quarter. Right now, the fourth quarter in the United States, growth is tracking at something like a 7% annual rate. You look, restaurant spending kept going up, for example. A lot of other service spending did. So I think Delta was nothing like the response people had the first time around. More people are vaccinated and know they're not at huge risk, or they're not vaccinated and they don't care as much about the degree of risk they're at. Delta's been a negative. I don't want to overstate my point, but it's been a much smaller negative than was feared, and than a lot of people think. Omicron, if it's, if it is considerably more deadly and more able to escape the vaccine, that could be a different story. Even there, I just think there's so much weariness and desire to be back to something more like a normal life. There's a better set of treatments than we had before, a better set of tests than we had before. I think we should be responding super vigorously on the health front. I think the president's absolutely right that the whole administration is all in on everyone getting a booster. I think that's terrific. I think they haven't done enough on testing. And, a lot of that's the FDA, not the White House, in terms of approving cheaper tests, and the FDA that they haven't, approved the Pfizer pill yet. I think is just, borders on nuts, when I think we know they're going to, and I don't know why they can't do that any faster. So there's things we need to do here. I think almost all of them are on the health response, not the economic response. And on the economic side, we just need to be wary. And if what I just said turns out to be too sanguine, the Fed should adjust, fiscal policy should maybe adjust, but I don't see any reason to do that right now.
I'm just going to interject because it hasn't come up yet. And if whatever happens with these new variants, I hope that one thing we've learned in the US is that we should never just be wholesale closing schools. Perhaps one of the things I'm most worried about as a lingering consequence or scarring effect of this pandemic is the tremendous learning loss that so many students experienced over the past 2 years, especially kids in the most vulnerable situations from economically disadvantaged homes, and the tremendous mental health crisis I think our policies of closures have caused for kids and young adults. So whatever the drag on the economy is, I hope we can muddle through while still allowing children to mostly go on with their lives. Okay.
Absolutely. The first thing that should close should be indoor restaurants. The last thing that should close should be schools. I don't think any of those need to close based on what we know now. But if it gets much worse, that's the order we should go in.
So we have 3 minutes before I'm going to turn this over to AESG co-chair Hank Paulson to close us out. And so I'll start with Holly, then Michael, then Chad, and then Jason if we have time. Last minute, what's sort of the one thing that you're really worried about in the post-pandemic economy will linger with us, or something that you think could be an improvement, a stronger economy, given what we've been living through in the past almost 2 years now? Holly.
Sure. So anything short of a shutdown, I agree with Michael that, a regular recession doesn't need a response like we had with PPP or anywhere close to that. Small businesses are dynamic. They come in and out of existence, and that is the benefit to our economy and our flexibility. What I strongly think is so important to small business owners is not to pile on more harm in operating a business. The more difficult it is for small businesses to operate, the more challenging recessions are for them to navigate through those. So the do no harm part of supporting small business, I think, is hugely important and cannot be overestimated.
Thank you. Michael.
In the near term, I'm most concerned about inflation. I think that there is not a whole lot that public policy can do, the fiscal policy can do to help with that. There's some things I would have the Fed do differently. One thing I think that the administration can do is not make the problem worse. I worry that the Build Back Better agenda would make it worse. The Build Back Better agenda would put a lot of money in the pockets of upper middle class households, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into the pockets of upper middle class households. It would increase the budget deficit over the next 2 years by $300 or $400 billion. That's a substantial amount of money, and I think that would increase consumer demand, and that would put upward pressure on prices at a time when we should be lowering prices. Over the longer term, I'm increasingly worried about a permanently lower employment rate and a permanently lower workforce participation rate than we would have had. Workforce participation among men has been declining for decades. Workforce participation among women has, at this point, been stagnant or declining for about 2 decades, not the 7 decades that it has been for men. And that's bad for all sorts of reasons. I think it's bad for individuals. I think it's bad for the economy as a whole, and I worry that this is going to exacerbate that problem.
Chad.
Me quickly. So I'm paid to think about trade and trade policy, and so my big concern is China. But it's maybe not the same concern as everybody else. It's more of, are we overreacting to China? And if we just entered into a world where it's all just about irrational politics and not grounded in sort of economic rationality anymore. I think that's not to say the Biden administration is heading there. I think they've actually done some positive things, taking it very slow with what they're doing directly with China, engaging, working with allies, trying to think about things like new rules. And I think that is the way to go. It's going to be hard. But I do think there is a big challenge ahead of us, and that is how to have a rational trade policy with respect to China.
Great. Thank you. Jason.
Read Till von Wachter's chapter in the book. We haven't discussed the ideas in it in this session. Unemployment insurance took on an incredibly important role over the last year and a half. In some respects, it was incredibly helpful in protecting people's incomes. In other respects, it was undesirable from anyone's perspective. It was generous, then not generous, then generous again, then not generous again. in ways that made no sense. So including triggers, doing more to focus on reemployment, more on keeping people connected to jobs and the like. Now is the time when we should be thinking about unemployment insurance for the next recession, not when Congress is pulling an all-nighter designing its rescue package in the next recession.
So that's a great plug for the policy volume. There's a number of terrific chapters in there that I think we've had expert authors highlight the situation we've been through, the lessons learned, and ways to better prepare our economy for the future. So please do go to the Aspen Economic Strategy website and download the book that's being released today. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thanks to all of you who logged on to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Aspen Economic Strategy Group co-chair, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson.
In the next recession.
So that's a great plug for the policy volume. There's a number of terrific chapters in there that I think we've had expert authors highlight the situation we've been through, lessons learned, and ways to better prepare our economy for the future. So please do go to the Aspen Economic Strategy website and download the book that's being released today. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thanks to all of you who logged on to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Aspen Economic. Hank, over to you.
Okay, can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
So first of all, a very big thank you to our speakers today and for all of you who have joined us online. I'm in New York City where it's such a beautiful day. I have to close the draperies behind me. It's so light. Otherwise you would see the East River and the Brooklyn Bridge. It's my great pleasure, before closing this out, to announce our 8 new members of the ASG. So we have 8 new members today. They are Darius Adamczyk, Kerwin Charles, Tony Coles, Karen Dylan, Kay Husbands Feeling, Craig Garthwaite, Edward Glazer, and Paul Ryan. Finally, and this is very important, a big thank you to Erskine Bowles. 5 years ago, Erskine and I made a decision to stand up the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, to create it. And I think an honest assessment will be it's broken to the high side. That's because of all of you outstanding members, due to Melissa, a lot of people, but to a large extent, Erskine. Erskine is not only a great friend, he is laser focused on policy. He is very politically astute, and he's got a surplus of graciousness to make up for all my deficiencies in that area. So he's been a wonderful partner, and I am also very, very pleased to announce Tim Geithner as the new chairman of the Economic Strategy Group. When Erskine came to me and said he wanted to transition from being a chairman to being a very active member, and he's going to continue to be a very active member, neither of us could think of a better co-head than Tim. It was my great pleasure and fortune to partner with Tim during the financial crisis a number of years ago, and a number of initiatives since then that have been less intense and more fun. And anyway, he's a very able man, and I'm really, really looking forward to working with him in the time ahead. I think we can accomplish a lot. Lastly, and very importantly, this 2021 policy volume, which you can find on our website, is really comprehensive, very good. I would urge you all to read it, but it's a lot to read. So you certainly should read parts of it, right? And disseminate it to friends and others you think will find it useful. So again, thank you all for a great session, and good afternoon.